Your little hobby shack is a clear and present danger to this community, Mr. Hayes. We're shutting you down, one way or another. The words dripping with a venomous sweetness hung in the crisp autumn air between my property line and the perfectly manicured sidewalk where she stood. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association, clutched a clipboard to her ample chest like a holy shield, a smear of bright pink lipstick forming a taut, disapproving line on her face. Her eyes, small and hard, raked over the brand-new, battleship gray metal siding of my workshop, a structure I had spent the better part of a year and a significant portion of my retirement savings to build. It was my sanctuary, my future, the place where the discipline and precision I learned in 20 years as an Army combat engineer would be transformed into custom furniture and art. To her, it was just a hobby shack, a dangerous one at that. I felt the familiar cold calm settle over me, the one that always came just before things got loud and messy overseas. I planted my feet on my own damn grass and met her gaze. This hobby shack, as you call it, I said, my voice level, was built to commercial-grade specifications, passed every single county inspection from the foundation pour to the final electrical sign-off, and is probably the most fire-resistant structure in this entire zip code. I have the binders of permits and engineering reports to prove it. She waved a dismissive, fleshy hand, the cheap gold bracelets on her wrist clinking together. Only county permits mean nothing to the association. We have our own covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Your industrial monstrosity is an aesthetic violation and, more importantly, a hazard. All that machinery, the chemicals, the sawdust, it's a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The sheer audacity of it, the weaponized ignorance, was breathtaking. She hadn't set one foot inside it, yet she'd already condemned it. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. It was about the fact that I hadn't bowed and scraped and asked her permission to build on my own land, which I had specifically purchased because it was a larger half-acre lot on the edge of the development, bordering undeveloped woodland. I had followed the law to the letter, but I had failed to follow the unwritten law of kissing her ring. "I'll be sending you the official notice of violation," she sniffed, already turning to leave, her victory assured in her own mind. "You'll have 30 days to cease operations and submit a plan for its demolition." The word demolition echoed in the space she left behind, a declaration of war. This is the kind of nightmare so many people face, and if you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and share your own story, because we're going to walk through exactly how you take back control when a bully with a clipboard tries to tear down your life's work. Now let me tell you how this all started. After 2 decades of building and, at times, deconstructing things in some of the world's least hospitable places, and I came home with a pension, a bad knee, and a deep-seated need to build something permanent, something for myself. My wife Sarah and I found this lot in Oak Ridge Meadows. The house was modest, but the land was the prize. It was enough space for the workshop I'd been designing in my head since I was a young sapper, sketching in a notepad in the back of a C-130. This wasn't just a shed. It was a 1,500 square foot steel frame building on a 6-inch reinforced concrete slab. I designed it myself, consulting with structural engineers and architects to ensure it was overbuilt in every respect. The electrical system was all commercial grade, with 4 separate 100-amp subpanels, every outlet a GFCI, all wiring run through metal conduit. The walls were double-layered with Type X fire-rated drywall over rock wool insulation. And I installed a professional dust collection system with a cyclone separator that vented outside through a filtered exhaust, and a full wet pipe sprinkler system tied directly into the main water line, the kind you'd find in a high-end commercial building. I even had a fire-rated steel door with a UL-listed panic bar. The county planning office loved my submission. The inspector, a grizzled old-timer named Dave, said it was the most robust residential auxiliary building he'd ever seen. He signed off on the final inspection with a grin, shaking my hand and telling me, "Son, you could survive a direct hit from a tornado in this thing." I had 3 thick binders, tabbed and organized, containing every permit, every blueprint, every engineering spec, every inspection report, and every receipt for every fire extinguisher and smoke detector. I knew the rules. I lived by them. My mistake was assuming Karen did too. Her first letter arrived 3 days after our confrontation, a crisp envelope with the HOA's faux elegant logo embossed in the corner. It was exactly as she'd threatened, a formal notice of violation. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak. It cited Section 7, Paragraph B of the Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, which vaguely prohibited any noxious or offensive activity and the erection of any structure out of harmony with the external design of the existing structures. It was a catch-all, a bludgeon designed to give the boards subjective power over anything they simply didn't like. My gray steel workshop, a model of functional modern design, Hani was apparently out of harmony with the 30-year-old beige and taupe vinyl-sided houses that made up the rest of the neighborhood. The second part of the letter was the real stinger. It invoked a subsection on safety, stating that the storage and use of flammable materials, including but not limited to paints, solvents, and wood dust, in a non-approved residential structure constitutes a fire hazard subject to immediate remediation. She was unilaterally declaring my county-approved over-engineered workshop a non-approved residential structure. The remediation she demanded was, again, the complete cessation of all work and the demolition of the building. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter flat under my palm, and felt a slow burn start in my chest. Sarah stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder. "John, this is insane," she whispered. "She can't be serious. Demolition? We have all the permits." I tapped the letter. "She's serious. This isn't about the rules, Sarah. It's about her rule. She's making a test case out of me." I spent the next 2 hours in my office, not my workshop. I pulled out my own copy of the CC&Rs, the thick document we'd been forced to sign at closing. I read Section 7, Paragraph B, and then I read the rest of the document, cover to cover, highlighting every passage that defined the board's authority, the appeal process, and, most importantly, its limitations. Her letter was sloppy. It was aggressive, but it was built on a foundation of sand. The CC&Rs clearly stated that all structures must comply with prevailing county and state building codes. My workshop didn't just comply, it exceeded them. The covenants also contained a clause, buried deep in the appendices, that grandfathered in properties on the perimeter of the development, like mine, with more lenient rules regarding auxiliary buildings, a relic from when the area was more rural. She was either ignorant of her own governing documents or, more likely, was hoping I was. My response had to be as meticulous and overwhelming as the workshop's construction. I didn't write an angry letter. I compiled a legal brief. I started with a cover letter, polite but firm, stating my rejection of the violation notice. "Dear Mrs. Albright and the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA Board," it began, using her formal name, a small psychological jab to remind her this was now official business. "I am in receipt of your letter dated October 12th. While I appreciate the board's commitment to community safety and aesthetics, the notice of violation contains significant factual and procedural errors. Therefore, the alleged violations are denied in their entirety." Then came the evidence. I created a numbered and tabbed appendix. Appendix A was a copy of the final, signed-off county building permit. Appendix B was the complete set of architectural and engineering blueprints. Appendix C was the report from the county fire marshal's preliminary inspection, which he'd done as a courtesy, praising the sprinkler system and fire-rated construction. Appendix D was a series of high-resolution photographs of the workshop, inside and out, showcasing its clean, professional appearance and the state-of-the-art safety equipment. On the final and most crucial section was Appendix E, Legal and Covenant Analysis. In it, I quoted the CC&R section that required compliance with county codes, followed by a point-by-point rebuttal of her claims. I cited the specific clause about perimeter properties. I addressed the noxious activity claim by including the spec sheets for my dust collection system, which filtered particles down to 1 micron, and stated that all finishing was done with low VOC, water-based products in a dedicated ventilated spray booth. I ended the letter by formally requesting the board rescind the violation notice and issue a written confirmation that the matter is closed. I made 2 copies of the entire package. One I sent via certified mail, requiring Karen's signature. The other I hand-delivered to the HOA management company's office downtown, getting a stamped receipt for my file. The ball was in her court. I had responded not with anger, but with overwhelming, undeniable fact. I had built my argument just like I built my workshop, on a solid foundation, with every joint tight and every angle true. I knew this wouldn't be the end. A bully like Karen doesn't back down when confronted with facts. They just get angrier that you dared to question their reality. But I had laid my first trap. By documenting everything and responding so thoroughly, I was creating a paper trail that would be indispensable if and when she decided to escalate. A week of silence followed. The certified mail receipt came back with Karen's spiky, indignant signature on it. I imagined her sitting in her overstuffed floral living room, the thick binder of my response open on her coffee table, much of her face turning a deeper shade of crimson with every page she turned. The silence wasn't peace, it was the low pressure before a storm. I knew she was regrouping, plotting her next move. I didn't let it stop me. I went out to my workshop every morning, the smell of fresh cut oak and steel filling the air. It was my therapy. I spent the week building a set of custom bookshelves for Sarah, the precise work of measuring, cutting, and joining the wood, a welcome antidote to the chaos Karen was trying to inject into our lives. But I wasn't naive. I installed 2 more security cameras, high-resolution models with night vision, one aimed squarely at the front of the workshop and the property line, the other covering the side that faced my nearest neighbor. When I bought a professional-grade decibel meter and started taking readings every hour I was working, the ambient noise of the neighborhood, distant traffic, lawnmowers, kids playing, was around 55 decibels. My most powerful tool, the 5-horsepower cabinet saw, running inside the insulated walls of the workshop with the door closed, registered at a mere 60 decibels at my property line, barely louder than a normal conversation. I logged every reading in a new binder labeled HOA harassment documentation. The first shot of the new campaign came not as a letter, but as a car. A beige sedan, the same make and model as the one Karen drove, began making slow passes by my house. It would slow down almost to a stop, the driver, a woman with the same distinctive silver blonde helmet of hair, clearly visible, just staring. And then it would speed up and drive off. It happened twice a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation, a juvenile power play meant to unnerve me. I simply made a note of the time and the license plate in my logbook, the camera footage automatically uploading to the cloud. Then came the acolytes, a couple I recognized from the HOA's summer barbecue, a thin, nervous-looking man named Gary and his perpetually scowling wife, began taking long, leisurely strolls that always seemed to pause right at the edge of my lawn. They'd stand there whispering to each other, pointing at the workshop. One afternoon, I saw Gary brazenly holding his phone up, clearly recording me as I carried a piece of lumber from my truck. I stopped what I was doing, looked directly at him, and gave a slow, deliberate wave. He flinched, quickly pocketing his phone, and they scurried away like startled raccoons. The anonymous complaint started a few days later, an email from the HOA management company forwarding a neighbor concern about excessive noise at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. I checked my log. I had been in the house eating dinner with Sarah since 5:30. The workshop had been dark and silent. I replied to the management company with a polite but firm email, attaching the timestamped security footage, showing the dark, inactive workshop and a screenshot of my noise log from that evening, which showed only ambient sound levels. I asked them to please inform the complainant of the facts and to ensure all future complaints were properly vetted before being forwarded to me. The next complaint was about noxious chemical fumes on a Saturday morning. I had been using a water-based wood stain, a product with 0 VOCs that smelled faintly of linseed oil. I sent back the manufacturer's safety data sheet for the product, highlighting the non-toxic and non-hazardous nature of the material. Each complaint was a probe, a pathetic attempt to find a weakness. Each time I met it with a calm, factual, and documented rebuttal. It was infuriating, but I refused to show it. Anger was what Karen wanted. She wanted me to yell, to break a rule, to give her the ammunition she craved. I would give her nothing but cold, hard data. Sarah was starting to fray. "They're just making things up now, John," she said one evening, her voice tight with anxiety. "How do you fight people who just lie?" I took her hand. "We don't fight them on their terms. We create a record. Every lie she tells, and what we counter with an undeniable truth. Every time she does something like this, she's just adding another page to the file I'm building against her. Let her. Let her bury herself in her own lies." The final straw in this phase of her harassment was the most blatant. An official-looking letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from a Community Standards Inspection Service. It informed me that, due to the complaints, they would be conducting an exterior property inspection the following Wednesday. I did a quick search for the company. It was a shell, registered just 2 weeks prior to an address that turned out to be a UPS store mailbox. The listed agent was a name I didn't recognize, but I had a pretty good guess who was behind it. On Wednesday morning, Gary and another man from the HOA board showed up, clipboards in hand, and while looking self-important, they didn't step on my property, but they walked the perimeter, peering over the fence, making notes. I watched them from my window, my main camera recording their every move. They were there for almost an hour, pointing at the gutters on the workshop, at the electrical service mass, at the ventilation exhaust. They were on a fishing expedition armed with ignorance. I let them finish their little pantomime. The next day, I received their report via email from Karen. It was a joke. Potential fire hazard, visible electrical mass not properly secured. It was secured with 3-inch lag bolts into a structural beam, as per code. Unapproved ventilation modification. It was part of the original county-approved plans. My favorite was improper storage of flammable debris, referring to a small pile of sawdust near my back door that the wind had blown out of the collection bin I was in the process of emptying. It was a campaign of attrition. She was trying to wear me down, to bury me in paperwork and phantom violations, hoping I would eventually give up and capitulate. She fundamentally misunderstood the type of man she was dealing with. I had spent years of my life in environments where a single misplaced detail could have fatal consequences. Patience and meticulous documentation weren't just skills for me. They were survival instincts. She thought she was dragging me into a swamp of bureaucracy. In reality, she was walking straight into my kill zone. Karen must have sensed that her campaign of petty harassment was failing. Though the nuisance complaints were going nowhere, her inspectors had found nothing of substance, and I was meeting every volley with an impenetrable wall of documentation. A cornered animal is a dangerous one, and Karen, cornered by her own failures, decided to go for the jugular. She decided to make her fire hazard claim official. One crisp November morning, a formal, intimidating letter arrived. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was on the letterhead of the county fire marshal's office. It stated that, in response to a formal and detailed complaint filed by a representative of the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association, a full fire and safety inspection of the structure at my address had been scheduled for the following Friday at 10 a.m. The letter detailed the inspector's legal right of access and the potential consequences of noncompliance or failure, which could include fines and a legally binding order to cease operations. This was her trump card. She had used her position, and likely some personal connection she had cultivated on the town council, to bypass the normal vetting process and force a state-sanctioned inspection. She believed, in her heart of hearts, that a real inspector would see things her way. She imagined a scenario where a uniformed official would walk in, gasp in horror at my table saw and drill press, and immediately slap a condemnation notice on the door, validating her crusade and handing her the victory she so desperately craved. Sarah read the letter over my shoulder, her face pale. "Oh my God, John, she actually did it. Can they do this?" I folded the letter calmly and placed it on the counter. "Yes, they can," I said, my voice betraying none of the cold fury coiling in my gut. "And we're going to let them." Sarah stared at me. "Let them? Shouldn't we call the lawyer? Try to stop it?" "No," I said, turning to face her. "This is exactly what I was waiting for. She thinks she's setting a trap for me, but she's actually stepping into mine. Her mistake is that she believes I'm hiding something. She thinks my workshop is just a bigger version of her husband's rickety garden shed. She has no idea what she's about to encounter. A slow smile spread across my face. I want this inspection to happen. I want it to be official. I want a county fire marshal to put his name on a report that says this building is not just safe, but exemplary. When her entire case against me is built on the lie that this workshop is a fire hazard, we're about to have a government official legally and permanently declare that a falsehood. For the next 4 days, I prepared, not out of fear, but out of a deep-seated professional pride. It was like preparing for a command inspection in the Army. I didn't have to fix anything. I just had to present it. I went through the workshop with a fine-tooth comb. I wiped down every surface, ensuring not a speck of excess sawdust was anywhere except inside the sealed collection drums of the dust collector. I polished the diamond plate threshold of the main door. I checked the pressure gauges on all 5 of my commercial-grade ABC fire extinguishers, even though I had just checked them the month before. Yet I tested the sprinkler system's flow switch and the battery backup on the smoke and heat detectors, which were all hardwired together. I organized my flammable materials cabinet, a bright yellow double-walled steel fortress, where I kept a handful of cans of stain and mineral spirits. I made sure every label was facing forward. Every can was sealed tight. It was already perfect, but I made it immaculate. The pièce de résistance was the documentation. I took my 3 binders, permits, plans, and harassment log, and laid them out on a clean workbench. I created a new, slimmer binder labeled Fire Marshal Inspection Packet. Inside, I placed copies of the most critical documents: the sprinkler system design and pressure test certificate, the electrical load calculations, the UL listings for the fire-rated doors, and the material specifications for the Type X drywall and rock wool insulation. I even included the manual for my dust collection system, with the section on its spark-arresting cyclone separator highlighted. I was going to hand the inspector a ready-made report. On Friday morning, I was ready. I was dressed in clean work pants and a collared shirt. The workshop was pristine, the lights were on, and the air was clean. At 9:55 a.m., I saw Karen's beige sedan pull up and park across the street. She got out, clipboard in hand, a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. She was here to witness my public execution. A few minutes later, a white county vehicle pulled up in front of my driveway. A man in a crisp blue uniform stepped out. He was about my age, maybe a little older, with a trim gray mustache and the weary, no-nonsense eyes of a man who had seen it all. The nameplate on his shirt read, Miller. He was the fire marshal. Karen immediately scurried across the street to intercept him. "Marshal Miller, thank you so much for coming," she gushed, her voice oozing faux concern. "I'm Karen Albright, the HOA president. We're all just so worried about what's going on in there." Miller gave her a curt, professional nod, his eyes already scanning the building. "Ma'am." He then turned his attention to me as I walked down the driveway to meet him. "Mr. Hayes?" "Yes, sir." "John Hayes," I said, offering my hand. He gave it a firm shake. "I'm Fire Marshal Miller. I'm here to conduct a safety inspection based on a formal complaint." "I understand," I said calmly. "I've been expecting you. Please come in." I led him toward the workshop. I'm keenly aware of Karen trailing a few feet behind us, practically vibrating with anticipation. She was about to get her show, just not the one she was expecting. I pushed open the heavy steel door to the workshop and stepped aside. "Welcome to my shop, Marshal." Miller stepped inside, and for a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. His professional-grade poker face didn't change, but I saw his eyes do a quick, systematic sweep of the space. He looked up at the exposed steel beams of the ceiling, at the neat runs of metal conduits snaking across the walls, at the bright red sprinkler heads spaced at perfect intervals across the ceiling. He saw the clean, gray-painted floor, the organized workstations, and the massive cyclone of the dust collector standing like a sentinel in the corner. Karen crowded in behind him, her smug expression faltering for just a second, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. This clearly wasn't the dusty, chaotic fire trap she had pictured in her mind. "Right," Miller said, "all business." He pulled out a checklist on his own clipboard. "Let's start with your fire suppression." I led him to the corner where the main riser for the sprinkler system came in. It's a commercial wet pipe system, I explained, tapping the bright red pipe, tied directly into the 4-inch water main at the street. We did a full pressure test before the walls went up. The certificate is in the packet on the bench over there. Miller nodded, running a hand over the main valve. He glanced at the gauge. Good pressure. He then walked the space, looking up at each sprinkler head, noting their placement relative to the machinery and workbenches. Coverage looks good. What about detection? I pointed to the ceiling. Hardwired, interconnected smoke and heat detectors with battery backup. One in each bay, and a dedicated heat detector directly over the main electrical panel. He walked over to the panel, a big 200-amp main breaker, with the 4 sub-panels branching off below it. Everything clearly labeled. He didn't even have to ask me to open it. I'd left the cover off, the neat, orderly wiring on full display. He grunted, a sound of what I took to be approval. Clean work, he said. Who did your electrical? I did, I replied. I was a combat engineer. Ran more field wiring than I can remember. Had it all inspected and signed off by the county, of course. Karen, who had been silently fuming, finally spoke up. But what about all the dust, she stammered. I pointing a trembling finger toward my table saw. Sawdust is explosive. Miller turned to her, a hint of impatience in his eyes. Ma'am, a certain amount of dust is expected in a wood shop. He then turned back to me. What's your dust management system? I walked him over to the big cyclone separator. It's a 5-horsepower system, pulls from every major tool. The main ducting is all metal to ground out static electricity. It separates the heavy particles into this sealed 55-gallon drum here, and the fine dust passes through a MERV17 filter before the air is exhausted outside. The air in here is probably cleaner than the air in your house. Miller inspected the motor, the grounding strap, the sealed drum. He nodded again. Good system. Top of the line for a shop this size. We moved on to the flammable materials cabinet. And I swung open the heavy yellow doors. Everything's stored in here. Nothing left out. He glanced inside at the neat rows of cans. Proper cabinet, properly used. Excellent. He went through his entire checklist. He checked the dates on my fire extinguishers. He tested the emergency exit light over the door. He measured the clearance around my workbench. With every item he checked, I saw the triumphant smirk on Karen's face slowly melt away, replaced by a mask of sour disbelief. After a thorough 45 minutes, Miller stood in the center of the workshop and made a final notation on his clipboard. He looked at me, then glanced over at Karen, who was now standing with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice loud and clear enough for her to hear every word. I've been a fire marshal for 18 years. In that time, I have inspected hundreds of commercial workshops, fabrication plants, and garages. I can tell you without a doubt that this is one of the safest, most well-built, and most meticulously maintained facilities I have ever seen. You exceed county code in at least a dozen different areas. Frankly, it's a fortress. He clicked his pen. You'll be receiving an official report in the mail that states this structure has passed inspection with a perfect score and is in no way a fire hazard to you or the community. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. Her face went from pink to a blotchy, furious red. What? That can't be right, she sputtered. He has chemicals. There's wiring. You have to shut him down. Miller turned to face her directly, his patience finally gone. Ma'am, with all due respect, you filed a complaint about a fire hazard. My job is to assess that hazard based on the law and the code, not on your feelings. And based on the code, the only hazard here today was the time I wasted that I could have spent inspecting a property that might actually need it. Annoyed and wanting to make his point, he gestured vaguely toward the road. You know, this whole subdivision is getting on in years. I should probably schedule a time to come back and take a look at the common areas. The clubhouse, the pool equipment room. Make sure your association is keeping its own house in order. It was an offhand comment, a professional jab meant to shut her up. But for me, hearing it, a light bulb didn't just go on. A floodlight lit up the inside of my skull. The clubhouse. Of course. Karen sputtered for another moment. And then realizing she was utterly defeated, she turned without another word, stormed out of my workshop and peeled away in her beige sedan. Miller shook his head, then turned back to me and handed me a copy of his preliminary field report. "Sorry about that, Mr. Hayes. You get these types in every neighborhood." "I understand," I said, taking the report. "And Marshall, thank you for your thoroughness." As he walked back to his truck, my mind was already racing. "Make sure your association is keeping its own house in order." Karen had brought the full weight of the county down on me, assuming I was in violation. It had never even occurred to her to check if she was. It was time to turn the tables. My war with Karen was about to enter a new, much more interesting phase. In the fire marshal's words echoed in my head for the rest of the day. "I should probably schedule a time to come back and take a look at the common areas." It was a seed planted in the fertile ground of my frustration. Karen had tried to use the rule of law to destroy me, only to have it completely vindicate me. Now it was my turn to pick up that same weapon. She had declared my brand new, over-engineered workshop a hazard. I started to wonder about the real hazards, the ones hiding in plain sight, the ones she was responsible for. The next Monday morning, I wasn't in my workshop. I was at the county records office, a drab, fluorescent-lit building that smelled of old paper and dust. I had a new mission. I was no longer just defending my property, I was going on the offensive. I started by requesting the master plans for the Oak Ridge Meadow subdivision. The clerk, a helpful woman who seemed intrigued by my specific request, wheeled out a cart loaded with massive, rolled-up blueprints and several thick, dusty binders. It felt like uncovering an ancient tomb. I carefully unrolled the first set of plans on a large table. They were dated 1962. The paper was yellowed and brittle. The architectural style was pure mid-century modern, a vision of suburban utopia with sleek lines and wide-open common spaces. I found what I was looking for, the plans for the community clubhouse. It was a single-story, sprawling building with a large hall, a small office, changing rooms, and a dedicated pump and filter room for the community pool. I spent an hour studying the original electrical schematics, and the notes were handwritten in elegant cursive. The technology was ancient. The entire building was serviced by a single 100-amp main panel. The wiring specified was knob and tube for most of the lighting circuits, a method that had been obsolete for decades. The outlets were all two-prong, ungrounded. It was a snapshot of a bygone era, a fire marshal's nightmare frozen on paper. Of course, the original plans were just that, original. Surely, I thought, it had been upgraded over the past 60 years. So I moved on to the permit binders. I started in the 1960s and worked my way forward, decade by decade, looking for any permits filed for 1200 Oak Ridge Lane, the clubhouse's address. What I found was shocking. There was a permit for a roof replacement in 1988, a permit for a plumbing repair to the pool changing rooms in 1997, on a permit to replace the HVAC unit in 2005. But there was nothing, not a single piece of paper, for a major electrical overhaul. No permits for a panel upgrade, no permits for rewiring. The only electrical permit in the entire file was from 2011 for the installation of a new light fixture in the women's restroom. That was it. For 60 years, the HOA, under the leadership of a long line of presidents, culminating in the safety-obsessed Karen Albright, had been patching and praying. They were running a modern facility with refrigerators, computers, televisions, and event lighting on an electrical system designed when a high-tech home appliance was a color television. I felt a grim satisfaction settle over me. This was more than just hypocrisy. This was negligence on a grand scale. Karen had the gall to call my state-of-the-art workshop a tinderbox, while she was presiding over a clubhouse that was, by all appearances, a genuine 1960s-era fire trap. I spent 3 hours at that table, using my phone to take crystal-clear pictures of every relevant document. The original 1962 electrical plans, the page from the permit log showing the lack of upgrades, the single minor permit from 2011. I was building a new binder. This one wouldn't be defensive. This one would be a weapon. When I got home, I made a few calls. The first was to an old Army buddy, Mike, who had left the service after his first tour and become a master electrician. I sent him the photos of the 1962 schematics. His text back a few minutes later was blunt. "Dude, is this a museum? Knob and tube? A 100 amp panel for a whole building? And that's not just out of code. That's insane. It's a miracle it hasn't burned down. My second call was to a neighbor, a quiet man named George who had lived in Oak Ridge Meadows since the late 1970s. He was one of the few original owners left. I found him tending his prize-winning roses. "George," I started, making small talk about the weather before getting to the point. "I was just wondering, you've been here a long time. Do you ever remember them doing any major work on the clubhouse? Like tearing out walls or redoing the wiring?" George leaned on his trowel and thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "Can't say that I do, John. They put the new roof on. I remember that, because the tar smell was awful for a week, and they redid the pool deck a few years back. But tear out the walls? No, no. And that building looks exactly the same inside as it did when my kids were swimming there in '78. Same light switches, same weird outlets." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said, not wanting to show my hand yet. "Thinking about renting it for a party." His confirmation was the final piece of anecdotal evidence I needed. The paper trail, or lack thereof, told one story. The living history of the neighborhood told the same one. The HOA was sitting on a ticking time bomb. My strategy began to crystallize. This was no longer just about me and my workshop. This was about the safety of the entire community, the families who use that clubhouse for birthday parties, the kids who use the pool all summer. Karen, in her obsessive quest to punish me for a phantom risk, had been ignoring a very real one that she was directly responsible for. I wasn't just going to win my fight. I was going to expose her, not just as a bully, but as a negligent and incompetent leader. And I was going to use her own beloved rules and procedures to do it. Armed with my research from the county records office and the confirmation from my electrician friend, I knew I couldn't just drop this bomb in an angry email. That was Karen's style, all emotion and accusation. My approach had to be different. It had to be formal, legal, and inescapable. It was time to spring the bureaucratic trap. My next stop was the office of a lawyer named David Chen. He was a sharp young attorney who had made a name for himself specializing in real estate and HOA disputes. He had a reputation for being a shark, but a shark who only took cases where his client was squarely in the right. I figured I qualified. I laid out the whole story for him in his sleek, minimalist office. I started with Karen's first threat of demolition, walked him through the harassment campaign, and ended with the triumphant vindication of the fire marshal's inspection. I then presented him with the new file, the 1962 clubhouse blueprints, the photos of the permit logs, my correspondence with Mike the electrician. Chen listened intently, his fingers steepled, not interrupting once. When I was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "this is not a case. This is a work of art. You've done 90% of my job for me." He picked up the photo of the 1962 electrical plan. "This is a kill shot. She's been harassing you for a year over a non-existent fire hazard you built, while presiding over a community center that is, by any modern definition, a tinderbox. The hypocrisy is staggering. The legal liability for the HOA is astronomical." He explained the legal framework. Under our state's laws, homeowners have the right to inspect the association's records, including all financial statements, contracts, and, crucially, maintenance and inspection reports for all common areas. "We're not going to make accusations," Chen explained, his eyes glinting. "Accusations can be denied. Instead, we are going to make a formal legal request for documents we know they don't have. We'll ask for the certificate of compliance for the clubhouse's electrical system. We'll ask for the annual fire inspection reports for the past 10 years. We'll ask for the maintenance logs for the emergency lighting and fire alarm systems. We're going to ask them to prove that the building is safe, and they won't be able to." The strategy was brilliant. It turned the tables completely. I was no longer the one being forced to defend myself. I was now the concerned homeowner, formally inquiring about the safety of the community's assets, and Karen would be the one on the defensive, legally obligated to respond. Chen drafted the letter right there with me. It was a masterpiece of polite, dispassionate, but legally ironclad language. It was addressed to the entire HOA board, not just Karen. It referenced the specific state statutes governing access to association records. It listed, in a clear, bullet-pointed format, the documents we were requesting. Pursuant to State Statute 720.303, and I hereby request the opportunity to inspect and copy the following records pertaining to the Oak Ridge Meadows Clubhouse, located at 1200 Oak Ridge Lane. 1. All electrical inspection reports and certificates of compliance from 2000 to the present. 2. All fire safety inspection reports conducted by county or independent inspectors from 2000 to the present. 3. Maintenance and testing logs for all fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, emergency lighting, and fire alarm systems from 2010 to the present. 4. Any and all engineering reports or assessments related to the structural and electrical integrity of the building. The letter concluded by giving them the statutory 30 days to comply. We sent it via certified mail from Chen's office, adding the weight of his firm's letterhead to the delivery. The waiting was the hardest part. For 3 weeks, there was silence. I could picture the panic in the HOA office. My letter wasn't a rant they could dismiss. It was a legal demand. They would have scrambled, searched their non-existent files, and realized the depth of the hole they were in. On the 29th day, a thin envelope arrived. It wasn't the packet of documents I had requested. It was a single-page letter from the HOA's lawyer. The tone was dismissive and arrogant. It stated that the board considered my request overly broad and burdensome. It included a copy of a receipt for the annual fire extinguisher service from a few months prior and a bill from an electrician for repairing an outlet in the office. That was it. They claimed these 2 documents satisfied their legal obligation. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to stonewall. And they were hoping I would be intimidated by the lawyer's letterhead and just go away. They had made another critical miscalculation. Chen was ecstatic when I forwarded him the letter. "They took the bait," he said over the phone. "This is better than I'd hoped. By providing a partial, completely inadequate response, they have failed to comply with the statute. They've just handed us the justification for our next move. We're no longer just asking for records, John. We're now in a position to demand action." The HOA's non-compliance was the key. It wasn't just about the potential danger of the clubhouse anymore. It was about the board actively and illegally concealing that danger from the homeowners who paid their salaries. This was no longer a personal dispute between me and Karen. This was a matter of public trust and safety. It was time to bring in the public. Karen's stonewalling was the signal. She had chosen secrecy over transparency, gambling that her authority and her lawyer's bluster would be enough to silence me. It was time to show her how wrong she was. My fight could no longer be a private, one-on-one battle of paperwork. To win, I needed allies. I needed to transform my personal grievance into a community movement. I started quietly. I identified a few neighbors I thought might be receptive. There was Mark, a young father of 2 who had recently complained at a board meeting about the rising HOA fees. There was Susan, a retired nurse who was a stickler for rules and safety. And there was Carol, a formidable retired history teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and had a healthy skepticism for authority. I didn't want a big public meeting yet. That would come later. This needed to be a small, strategic gathering. I invited them over to my house one evening under the pretense of a simple get-together. Sarah made coffee and set out some cookies. We sat in the living room, and I laid everything out on the coffee table. I started with my story. I showed them the initial violation letter from Karen, the one threatening demolition. I showed them the pictures of my pristine workshop and the fire marshal's glowing report. They were shocked. Mark shook his head. "She tried to have you tear that down. It's the nicest building in the whole neighborhood." Then I pivoted. "This was never about my workshop," I said, my voice low and serious. "That was just the excuse. This is about unchecked power and, as I've recently discovered, dangerous negligence. And it affects every single one of us." I then unveiled my second binder, the one labeled Clubhouse Investigation. I showed them the 1962 blueprints. I showed them the photos of the county permit logs, with decades of empty pages where electrical upgrades should have been. I passed around the dismissive letter from the HOA's lawyer, the one that proved they were hiding something. Susan, the retired nurse, put on her reading glasses and studied the letter. They're legally required to provide those records, she said, her voice sharp with indignation. This is a deliberate cover-up. Carol, the teacher, was quiet, her sharp eyes taking in every document. She tapped the 1962 blueprint. I remember when my son had his 10th birthday party in that hall. We plugged in a crock pot and a stereo, and the lights flickered all afternoon. We just thought it was a quirk of the building. We never imagined. Her voice trailed off. The mood in the room shifted from friendly support for me to a shared sense of alarm and betrayal. It was their kids who played in that building. It was their money, our money, that paid for the insurance and upkeep on a facility the board knew, or should have known, was a potential death trap. So what do we do? Mark asked, leaning forward. We can't let her get away with this. This was the moment I was waiting for. We don't fight her in the shadows anymore, I said, outlining my plan. We bring it into the light. The annual HOA budget meeting is in 2 weeks. It's the one meeting all year that the board can't control the agenda for. It's open for new business from the floor. The room will be full of homeowners concerned about their dues. That's where we make our stand. My plan was simple and followed HOA procedure to the letter, using their own rules against them. Carol, as a respected longtime resident, would be the one to formally raise the issue from the floor. She would ask a simple, direct question about the safety of the clubhouse and the board's refusal to provide inspection records. I would then stand up, not as an aggrieved party, but as a concerned resident presenting the evidence I had gathered. Mark and Susan would be in the audience, ready to second the motion and ask follow-up questions. We weren't going to be an angry mob. We were going to be an organized, informed, and unstoppable force for transparency. Over the next 2 weeks, our small group worked in secret. We drafted a formal motion demanding an immediate, independent, and comprehensive safety inspection of the clubhouse to be paid for by the HOA's Emergency Reserve Fund, with the full report to be made public to all homeowners. We created a one-page fact sheet summarizing my findings: the 1962 wiring, the lack of permits, the board's refusal to release records, to hand out to our neighbors as they entered the meeting. We called other residents we trusted, letting them know that something important was going to be discussed at the meeting and that they needed to be there. We weren't spreading rumors. We were encouraging attendance and participation. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse hall was packed, more so than any meeting in recent memory. People were standing along the back wall. Karen was at the head table with the rest of the board, well-looking smug and powerful as she droned on about landscaping contracts and pool pump maintenance. She had no idea what was coming. She thought she had won. She thought she had silenced me. She saw a room full of subjects. I saw a jury. The air was thick with anticipation. After the treasurer's report on the proposed budget increase, Karen finally said the words we were waiting for. "Is there any new business from the floor?" A thick silence fell over the room. Then Carol stood up, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, Madam President, I have a question." Carol stood tall in the middle of the crowded room, a picture of civic dignity. All eyes turned to her. Karen, at the head table, forced a tight, condescending smile. "Of course, Carol. What is it?" "Madam President," Carol began, weren't her voice carrying the practiced authority of a career teacher. "I have a question regarding the safety and structural integrity of the very building we are sitting in tonight. Several residents have become concerned about the lack of available maintenance and safety records for this clubhouse. Could the board please inform the community when the last comprehensive electrical safety inspection was performed on this facility?" The room went quiet. The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly unexpected. Karen's smile faltered. She glanced at the other board members, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "Well, Carol," she began, her voice losing some of its commanding tone, "all of our community assets are, of course, regularly maintained to the highest standards. We have everything under control." It was a classic non-answer, a platitude meant to dismiss and move on. But Carol didn't sit down. "With all due respect, that's not what I asked. I asked for a date. When was the last time a licensed electrician or county inspector certified that the 60-year-old wiring in this building is safe?" Karen's face began to flush. "We have professionals who handle these things. We have a contract with an electrician who comes out whenever he's needed." This was the opening. Before Karen could shut down the discussion, I stood up from my seat near the back. "Madam President," I said, my voice calm and measured, "perhaps I can shed some light on the subject." Karen's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing with pure hatred. She knew this was a coordinated attack. "Mr. Hayes, unless this is not the forum for your personal grievances about your workshop." "This has nothing to do with my workshop," I said, holding up the binder I'd brought with me. "This has to do with public records I obtained from the county. This has to do with a formal request for documents that this board refused to provide. This has to do with the safety of every person in this room." A murmur went through the crowd. I had them. I walked to the front of the room and laid the 1962 blueprint on a table for all to see. "These are the original electrical plans for this building. They specify knob and tube wiring and a 100 amp service. According to county records, there has never been a permit issued for a major electrical upgrade. Ever." I then held up the letter from the HOA's lawyer. When I legally requested the inspection reports to verify the building's safety, this is what I received. A letter telling me my request was burdensome, along with a receipt for a single repaired outlet. This is not transparency. This is a cover-up. The room erupted. People started talking all at once, looking around at the old light fixtures and the discolored outlet covers with new alarmed eyes. Mark stood up. "So you're telling us our HOA fees are paying for a building that might be a fire trap, and the board is hiding it from us?" Susan stood up. "I want to see the inspection reports. We have a right to see them." Karen began banging her gavel on the table, her face a mask of fury. "Order! This is out of order. Mr. Hayes is spreading malicious lies to undermine this board." "They are not lies," I boomed, my voice cutting through the noise. "They are facts backed by public documents. If what I'm saying is untrue, then produce the records. Produce the certificate of compliance for the electrical system. Produce the fire marshal's annual inspection reports. If you have them, this discussion is over." The board members stared at her, their faces pale. They knew they had nothing. Karen was cornered, exposed, and her only instinct was to attack. "You have no right," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You've been a thorn in this community's side since you moved in with your monstrous, illegal factory." Her personal attack in this context was a fatal mistake. It showed the entire room that this was, and always had been, a personal vendetta for her, not a matter of principled governance. She looked unhinged. Carol seized the moment. "Madam President, this behavior is unacceptable. I am formally making a motion that the HOA immediately fund a Level 3 comprehensive engineering and safety inspection of this clubhouse by a certified independent firm, not one of the board's choosing. The full unredacted report must be distributed to every single homeowner. Do I have a second?" "I second the motion," Mark yelled from the crowd. At least a dozen other voices joined him. Under the HOA's own bylaws, a motion made and seconded from the floor at the annual meeting must be put to a vote. Karen was trapped. Her face was a mottled purple. She looked at the sea of angry, determined faces, and she knew she had lost. "All in favor?" Carol called out. A forest of hands shot up. It was nearly unanimous. "Are we all opposed?" Karen and two of her board cronies raised their hands weakly, a pathetic island in a sea of dissent. The motion passed. It was a complete and total public humiliation. Her authority wasn't just challenged, it was shattered. She had been beaten, not by threats or anger, but by facts, rules, and a community that had finally found its voice. She stared at me across the room, her eyes promising a war that she no longer had an army to fight. The game was over. All that was left was for the final, damning evidence to be brought into the light. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was swift and brutal for Karen. The community's trust in her had evaporated overnight. The vote had been a public referendum on her leadership, and she had lost in a landslide. The board was compelled by its own bylaws to execute the motion, and they moved with the leaden reluctance of a condemned man walking to the gallows. They hired an independent engineering firm from a list of 3 that our small group provided, ensuring there would be no cronyism involved. The inspection was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I made sure to be there. So did Fire Marshal Miller. After our initial encounter, I had kept in touch with him, providing him with a copy of my findings and the HOA's non-response. He wasn't officially part of this inspection, but he told me he would be there as an interested observer on behalf of the county. He wanted to see the outcome as much as I did. The inspection team arrived, a group of 3 serious-looking engineers with cases full of diagnostic equipment. Karen was there, a pale ghost of her former self. She wasn't carrying a clipboard. She wasn't smiling. She stood silently in a corner, watching her kingdom crumble. The lead engineer, a man named Peterson, started with the main electrical panel, the same one I had identified from the 1962 plans. He took the cover off, and a collective gasp went through the room. It was a rat's nest. Wires were tangled together, insulation was cracked and brittle, and multiple circuits were dangerously overloaded and doubled up on single breakers. "Well," Peterson said dryly, "here's our first problem." He pointed with his pen. "That's active knob and tube wiring right there, spliced directly into a modern Romex line with nothing but electrical tape. This entire panel is a fire waiting to happen." They moved through the building, using thermal cameras on the walls and testers on the outlets. The news got worse at every turn. They found live wires in the ceiling attic with no junction boxes. They found that most of the outlets were not grounded, including the ones in the kitchen area used for coffee pots and warming trays during events. The emergency exit lights, which Karen had sworn were functional, had dead batteries and hadn't been tested in years. The fire extinguishers, while serviced, were the wrong class for a kitchen area with a grease fire potential. The most damning discovery came from the attic space above the main hall. One of the younger engineers poked his head up and called down, Mr. Peterson, you need to see this." Peterson and Miller climbed the ladder. I was right behind them. The air in the attic was thick and hot, and there, lying across the old dusty insulation, there were the telltale ceramic knobs and cloth-covered wire of the original 1962 wiring, still live, still powering half the lights in the building. Worse still, in several places, the insulation had been chewed away by squirrels, leaving bare, exposed copper wire just inches from the dry wooden roof trusses. Miller just stood there, slowly shaking his head. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, "this isn't a code violation. This is an active death trap." When they came back down, Peterson's face was grim. He looked directly at the remaining board members, ignoring Karen completely. "I am shutting this building down. Effective immediately. It is unsafe for public occupancy. I am officially condemning it until the entire electrical system is ripped out and replaced, and the structure is brought up to modern code." He slapped a bright red "Condemned Unsafe for Occupancy" sticker on the front door. The sound of the adhesive sticking to the glass was the final nail in the coffin of Karen's reign. The report from the engineering firm was devastating. It was a 50-page document detailing dozens of life-threatening code violations. It estimated the cost of remediation to be well over $200,000, a massive sum that the HOA's mismanaged reserve funds could barely cover. A special emergency meeting was called. This time Karen didn't even show up. Her 2 remaining allies on the board resigned via email an hour before the meeting began. The community, led by Carol and myself, voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as president in absentia. The fallout was immense, and the HOA's insurance carrier, upon seeing the report, threatened to drop their coverage entirely unless the repairs were made immediately. A special assessment had to be levied on all the homeowners to cover the massive cost of Karen's decades of neglect, a fact that made her name a curse word in the neighborhood. In the turmoil, a leadership vacuum was created. A delegation, led by Carol and Mark, came to my house a few days later. "John," Carol said, "we need you. We need someone who understands rules, who knows how to manage a project, and who we can trust to see this through. We want you to be the interim HOA president." I almost laughed. Me, the man who had been public enemy number 1, now being asked to lead the organization. I had no desire for the power, but I recognized the duty. This was my community too. My neighbor's safety was on the line. I accepted on the condition that it was only until the clubhouse was repaired and a new permanent board could be properly elected. The next 6 months were a blur of work. I was no longer fighting a war. I was managing a reconstruction project. I oversaw the bidding process for the rewiring. I held weekly progress meetings, and I sent out detailed email updates to every homeowner, ensuring the absolute transparency that had been so sorely lacking. We used the crisis to make other needed improvements, upgrading the insulation and installing energy-efficient windows. Finally, the day came for the final inspection. Fire Marshal Miller walked through the newly renovated clubhouse. The walls were fresh, the lights were bright LEDs, and the new 200-amp panel was a work of art. And he signed the certificate of occupancy with a flourish. "Looks good, Mr. President," he said with a smile. "Almost as good as your workshop." That evening, I stood in the doorway of my own workshop, the place this all began. The air was cool, and the familiar, comforting smell of sawdust hung in the air. I flipped on the lights and looked at the project on my workbench, a beautiful, handcrafted cradle for Mark's new baby. The sound of my saw starting up, once a supposed noxious activity, was now just the sound of a man working in peace, in a community he had, against all odds, helped to heal and make safe. I never saw Karen again. I heard she sold her house at a loss and moved 2 towns over. Sometimes victory isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a community protected, and the simple, hard-won freedom to build something of your own on your own damn land.